Okay. Final painting demo for our watercolor class. This paper is a little bit bigger. This is 11 by 14. Excuse me. I'm treating myself because I'm excited for this painting. Any other ratio close to that, though, is totally fine. 9 by 12 or even 8 by 10. It might affect the, like what I'm going to do now, looking at the just sort of one landmark to the next and how close it is to that outside edge of the picture plane. So in a way, what I'm drawing right now is the negative space around the figure. Not that that's like the most accurate way to do this, but it's it's easy to lose sight of once we're kind of in the figure, paying attention to landmarks and anatomy. I want to get the amount of negative space right. If I was doing this in person from direct observation, I would probably do a thumbnail drawing to figure out the composition. But I've like kind of manipulated the photo a little bit to I've already put that in to make this like the reference is pretty easy. Or that's not the right word. The reference is like the composition's already worked out. But at the same time, we don't really even it could be the perfect photo. We could feel really confident about that. We never really know what's gonna happen until we start putting marks on the page. So at this stage, especially, keep backing up, looking at the whole piece of paper here. I'm doing a lot of comparative measuring from above and below. So this negative little diamond shape in the arm here, this shadow, I'm thinking about each corner and where it lines up. So right here, one landmark I'm seeing up here is the where the clavicle comes out, kind of reaches back towards where the scapula is reaching forward, and it meets up with the deltoid right here. You can see these bumps along the way of the collarbone catching some light there. This is the trapezius muscle behind that. These landmarks, I'm lining them up with this corner down here. It's a little bit further out to the left, so I'm going to shift this over a little bit. Those little adjustments are what I'm looking for over and over again. Not trying to add more information, not trying to make anything more complex, trying to keep things simple. So in a way, that simplicity has to be maintained. It's easy, it can run away from us really easily. So going back to that quote from earlier, I'll read it again just for the recording here, but excuse me. Clutter and confusion are failures of design, not attributes of information. Not to say that like if you don't any confusion in a painting is a failure. That's kind of a harsh word. And that's not what I mean to say, but just something I see a lot in myself or in my students' work is okay, I don't really understand this area, so I'm just going to make it more detailed and that'll fix everything. And I'm saying don't do that. Please don't do that. And the more when I see paintings that are really accurate but really simple, I know that that person really paid attention. You can't fake simplicity. I think Einstein said, it might have been Einstein, said you don't really understand something until you can explain it simply, something along those lines. So I try and do that with drawing. using a lot of straight lines to construct this. You could also think about using just like a what I call an envelope shape to just contain the whole figure. So if we had to pick one line from the outside edge of this shoulder all the way down to the elbow, one simple line there, and then going from that shoulder up to the head from here, another straight line for there, trying to find the apex of each of these curves. Sometimes a straight line like that can help us like contain the whole figure and get a more accurate read on that positive negative space thing, just on like a compositional level, compositional mindset. That makes sense. We can't really see. So underneath these bracelets right here is going to be the end of the ulna. It's this right here. So if you think about this bump right here on your wrist that I'm pointing to, this is resting underneath those bracelets. I'm looking and it seems to be lining up with his right eye or the eye on our left. That might be a helpful landmark. So that's something I want to know where it is. So I'm marking that off. The line of the knuckles here is kind of just before that shadow edge starts over here. So I feel like a lot of this is still shifting over. Maybe I made his shoulders too narrow from the start. And the way that he's leaning, the way you can kind of picture how his lower back is arched and his shoulders are kind of, his chest is opening with pushing his shoulder blades together. Even though all that's covered with fabric, we can still get a sense of it from just a handful of landmarks that we can see. Seems like the top of the knuckle right here is a little bit above this elbow over here to the left. Another helpful landmark if you're thinking about where the elbows are in space. This elbow's a little bit lower over here. If drawing this out is just daunting and too much of a challenge and going to take up too much time, you are free to use a grid system if that's more helpful. And you're here to just focus on the paint itself. That's okay. Any kind of system you want to use to get that drawing down. Once we get a general sense of where everything is going, which I feel like we are close to here, we're going to take a closer look at the head and the face. This cane his hands are resting on, also a good landmark, seems to be lining up more or less directly under the armpit, maybe a little bit to the right. And it's almost vertical, but not quite. Seems to be leaning a tiny bit. Maybe it would help the composition if it was vertical. Not sure. The ears are an important landmark. Think about the distance from the trapezius right here, the top, this top outer contour of the shoulder. Think about the negative space between here and that ear and ask yourself, is that too much or too little? The bottom of his chin, like at the base of the jaw right here, with the facial hair on top of it, is just a little bit above the top edge of that trapezius and where it overlaps with the rest of the neck. Sternomastoid here coming down from behind the ear towards the collarbone, towards the pit of the neck here, which we can't see, but that overlap of those two is important. So use the jewelry, use the fabric, use light and shadow shapes, positive, negative shapes. All of those different elements can be used as landmarks and points of reference. Okay, so before we dive into the face, I want to pull up this drawing from the other day. So in here, I looked at the planes of the head. Remember, before we paint a face, we want to really understand how to draw the whole head. With JJ, we can really see the top of his skull, the side planes of the forehead, which is helpful. But here I drew out the planes of the brow ridge, the bridge of the nose here, and this shape right here, that keystone shape between the two eye sockets. Excuse me. So we want to think about how the eyeball fits into the eye socket and how that creates light and shadow pattern, not just on the eye itself, but on these planes around the eye. The ears are a great landmark. He's kind of above our his eyes are above our eye level. So we're looking up into his face and his head is tilted back just the tiniest bit. I can tell just because if we look at the tops of the ears, his brow extends above that just a little bit, and the base of the nose is also a little bit above the bottoms of the ears. So that tells me the head is tilted back just the tiniest bit. So keep that in mind. Use the ears as a landmark again. For the mouth, think about the mouth as this like whole spherical shape with like more complex forms on top of it. It's easy to kind of hide behind this facial hair. We do want to block that out and not make it too dark too early. But be aware of like the bigger volume of how the whole head kind of turns around. There's going to be light and shadow on the facial hair just as much as it's on the lips or the chin. Here's that muscle coming from behind the ear down towards the pit of the neck right here. And then this is the collarbone shooting out from there with that other muscle behind those. So those overlaps too, they're subtle but important. And again, just think about this, the like cranium part of the whole head. Think about that as a sphere and how this kind of wraps around pretty slowly, this long drawn out form shadow. There's smaller forms on top of that, like wrinkles in the skin and all those kinds of things, but we want to understand the bigger shapes first. Also think about the side planes of the head, like these two corners of the forehead also play a role in the light and shadow that we're seeing. So keep that in mind, even now as we're drawing. I'm not going to overload the head and the face with fancy details. I just want to get an understanding of all these different planes. So like I said, the top of the brow is a little bit higher than the tops of the ears.
Should the top of the brow be you normally even with the top of the ear?
Yeah,
I guess.
yeah.
And the tip,
We can always double check here on Zoom.
no, that's good. You know what makes it somewhat difficult to the eyes? He's looking off to his left, and the eyes aren't real symmetrical.
That's true. Eyes are never symmetrical though.
Oh, okay.
Eyes, let me real quick, right on here. Um, yeah, that's important. Let me draw this eye socket right here. Or no, I'll do the other eye socket because let me draw his right eye. Starting off with the eye socket. Anytime we're drawing an eye, we want to draw the eye socket first.
Right. But that's the one that seems a little tilted, isn't it? His right eye.
Yeah, and he's kind of making a face a little bit like his eyebrows are raised the tiniest bit,
Yeah.
but we can really see the eye socket and the muscles around the eye. But so if I draw this first, this is our eye socket, and then the eye fits, or the eyeball fits into the eye socket, sort of in this way. A little bit of negative space in two of the corners there. And then the muscle above the eye right there. So you can really see, let me share my screen and I'll zoom in on it. Anytime I'm drawing or painting someone's eyes, I'm thinking about the planes around the eye first. The last thing I'm really gonna consider is like what the pupil is doing, where he's looking. It's the direction of the gaze is important, but we want to think about all of those structures first.
Yeah.
So if I draw that here, let me set this up. Sorry, this door in my studio is making so much noise. I gotta close it in a second. So we want to think about this crease of where the eyeball kind of rolls back and meets. It's like that first crease on the very top of what we're seeing, the eyeball there. Basically, what we want to do is we want to understand like the structure of the eye fitting into the eye socket, and then there's muscle on top of that, and then there's the eyeball itself, and then there's skin on top of that. So there's a lot of layers to peel back and understand. But basically, if we remember that the eye is a sphere like this, the light source is coming from the left. Here's our really simple light shadow and form shadow. Light's coming from over here. We want to find the same thing over here. It's just there's a little bit more steps because there's a couple more planes. But even the way that the eyelid wraps around the eyeball, like let's say we're wrapping it around here, it's not symmetrical. And you can look at your own eyes the next person you see, look at their eyelids. They're not going to be symmetrical. This is actually fun to draw. This will be good for us to paint because I didn't realize how open his eyes really are. Usually we see a little bit less of the pupil and the whites of the eyes, but there's a lot of great light in here. So these lines around that kind of show us where the eyeball kind of rolls back and meets up with that muscle above it and how the skin overlaps and interacts with those forms, that you're going to get as much out of the likeness there as you do looking at the pupil of the eye. It's not that the pupil is unimportant. It is important, but we have to weigh it more or less, or try and weigh it as equally as all these other things around it. I'd say for the most part, most people drawing and painting eyes, if they had to weigh all of these different forms and planes, I think they would give the pupil 90% of their attention and the rest to all this other important stuff. I would say give it like an even spread, all these different things. The way the light is hitting even this plane down here. This is lighter here. This is all kind of wrapping around towards darkness up here. This is the darkest. And then right here, we have another light shape. Not quite as bright as right here. Like here's another highlight on this side. And then finally, way up here, it's finally rolling back towards shadow again. Partly because he's like making an expression. His eyebrows are raised, so his eyebrows are a little bit higher. And this inside tear duct right here, catching some light, you can see from there how these planes kind of roll up and over across the bridge of the nose. And then going straight down from this inside corner, that tear duct catching the light right there, I always try and find that line straight down from there to the nostril. But we'll get there way later. But since you just brought that up about the eyes, number one, not symmetrical. They never are. But again, think about that underlying form of the whole eye in the whole eye socket. And even here, so back to the whole head, we're not even quite there yet. I'm gonna like really just section off this whole brow shape as one big shape here. Base of the nose a little bit high. The cheekbones are really clearly defined here. How they come up and meet the side plane of the forehead up here. So as I said earlier, this piece of the ulna down here seems to line up vertically with this eye. I might be a little bit off. So maybe this eye needs to shift over. Or the ulna has to come back, but I don't think it's that. So I'm gonna good to have a little backup measurement just to check in, like something that has nothing to do with the face or the head. So I'm moving. Yeah, this whole cheekbone had to move over. So does everyone understand what I just did? I'll explain it again. Earlier on, I was kind of drawing through the torso, the elbow, the whole arm, and I wanted to mark off where this side of the ulna is right here, this part of the wrist that kind of bulges out. It's a little bit blocked by these bracelets, but it's a really important landmark for kind of getting the planes of the forearm understood. And I noticed that this, if we go vertically, let me share my screen. Straight up from here, it brings us roughly to the corner of this eye. So that stuck out to me as an important little relationship. Let's check with the ruler. I'm still working on this drawing from the other day. Sorry. So let's break out the ruler. Yeah, so see how that's lining up with that eye. So I just kept that in mind. And now that we're finally here and I'm placing the eye, I checked. My eye was to the right of the ulna down here. So either the ulna is off or the eye is off. And what I did was I made room. I kind of shifted that eye over, which means shifting over this edge of the cheekbone. And I think that helped. So, excuse me. What's helpful about using the ulna as a, not that it always has to be the ulna, it could be anything in the picture at all, any landmark. But since it has nothing to do with the face, it's not really like involved, it's easier to make that measurement and it's easier to tell if it's off. So that's how that happens, and I think it helped. Try it one more time to be really sure here. Yeah, nice. Is there any interest at all in, instead of the final critique, just continuing on this painting together next week?
I'd like that.
Yeah, I kind of prefer that too. Are there any other opinions about that? We could do a, like, we'll check in the beginning with where everyone's at with this painting.
I'm good with that.
Yeah, that's fine with me too.
I feel like we'll all learn more. I feel like we'll get more out of this. I'd be a little sad to not have our usual end of the semester final critique, but I want to paint. And if anyone has been working on a final painting outside of what we've been doing in class, I'm more than happy to take the time to show everyone and talk about it. So we can still submit those if you'd like. But I think it'd be nice to have a little bit more time on this painting. It's 10:45. We're still finessing the drawing here. I don't want to rush this. Yeah, I think that'd be good if we had some painting time next week. So I'll plan on that. I'm still just moving around. Again, like I said earlier, I'm checking in, making sure things are in the right place, not necessarily trying to make them more detailed. We can find that along the way with the paint. We just want a foundation that we can trust. And maybe a foundation that's still a little flexible. Who knows what we'll run into along the way. Maybe our drawing is a little bit off, or maybe we find somewhere where we want to leave the photo behind. Sometimes that discovery only comes once we're sort of really in the painting and invested in it. And that's a good option to have. Another thing about the eyes, so as I'm drawing these eyes in here, they might look larger than than I intend to paint them. The like whites of the eyes, the actual space between the eyelids is much smaller than we think it is. I'm kind of zeroing in on that as time goes on, but don't overestimate like the whites of the eyes and the pupil, how large that space is between the eyelids. We tend to think it's bigger than it is because that's where we spend a lot of time looking when we talk to people and look at people. That space is actually pretty small. A good way to judge the length of the nose, I mentioned this earlier, is coming down from this inside corner. Let me zoom in a little bit. From this inside corner here, straight down to the top edge of this nostril right there. This space too tends to be a little bit smaller than we think it is. Or at least that's my habit that I've noticed over the years. You can see this little light shape right in the dead center front facing plane on the bridge of his nose right there. That's another helpful landmark. And keep in mind, a lot of these pencil marks I'm drawing will go away. Drawing through this is my way of sort of like testing things out. What I'm after is just the location of these things, the relationships between them, their proximity to each other, the actual amount of light and the different colors and stuff. That's all going to be worked out with paint, and I don't want the pencil lines to step on that, especially in an area like this where there's so much light already. As far as masking fluid and blocking things, I'm going to use masking fluid on this earring right here. It's a lot of really sharp shapes, probably the most contrast. We talked about that earlier. Probably the most contrast in the painting is right here, where that light shape of the earring is surrounded by that dark shape of the background. And the edges are all very sharp. It's a really graphic shape. I think it's cool. I think it's a cool thing to highlight. So I don't mind having that amount of contrast. I don't think we have to really turn it down to downplay it too much. We can paint it as is. I'm going to try and use the masking fluid for that. But for the facial hair, I think I'm just going to paint it lighter. Or I mean, sorry, like not paint it as dark in the beginning. There is some form to it, like I talked about earlier, like the whole chin kind of wrapping around. There's some form and volume in there that we should be aware of. Okay, I'm going to zoom out a little bit here and start to lighten this drawing, and we can finally start thinking about painting. If I really wanted the likeness to be perfect, if this was like a paid commission and it had to look really, really good, I would probably spend more time on the drawing, getting it absolutely perfect. Probably would have done some more sketches to prepare for it, but I think we're close enough for now for the sake of this painting and this class. I feel pretty good about where it's at. Remember, it's more about figuring things out, getting them in the right spot as a practice round, and less of like making a line drawing that we just color in. Okay. So where do we begin? I'll ask you all first. What would be a good place to start with this? It's a lot to paint here. Any recommendations? I'm just laying out some of my pigments here.
The overall undertone, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it'd be good to get an idea of, yeah, that light kind of glowing through. I think mapping out the shadows. We want to think about like what's the overall story here before we just dive in and start painting. What is happening with the light? What are these relationships? So let me share my screen real quick. If we look at this, excuse me, there's warm light coming from the left, but there's also reflected light that's cooler coming from the right side, which is interesting. So what we can do is give an overall tone to the figure up against these warmer tones on the right side. And we want to be aware of that and how they all kind of meet up in the middle. So the line of the core shadow, remember the core shadow is like that line where it starts turning from dark to light. We could say that's this line kind of follows through here. That's going to be the darkest part of that shadow. It gets lighter in the reflected light over here, and obviously it's lighter over here where it's getting hit by direct light. This, as it turns, so this bicep right here is a good example of what the light's doing in general. Starting out really light and warm. As it gets darker, it's getting a little bit warmer and more saturated right before the core shadow. We're kind of in where the form shadow is beginning here. Here in the core shadow is where it flips. It goes from warm to cool, and it's darkest in this area in here. and then it gets lighter again, but it's cooler and more blue. It's in the photo here, it's pretty gray in this zone. I think for the sake of our painting, we could think about our complementary colors and we can maybe push that to be a little bit more blue. Maybe. These shadows here in the fabric are nice and easy and clear cut. They all seem pretty warm too. It's a little tricky to see the difference between the background and the form shadow right here. So we could leave that as is, or we could maybe show a temperature shift, but while maintaining the value. And again, before I forget, I do want to mask out that little shape right there, if it's possible. It's kind of hard to get. I wonder if it's easier to just paint that. Well, let's try to mask it. I'll try and see what happens. I use my masking fluid like twice a year, so let's see if it obeys me. Also with the masking fluid, I like using this tinier brush that I don't really care about from my little travel kit. You can see there's stuff on it even from last time. So what I do is I dip this in soap first, just as a protective barrier. I'll wipe it, I'll wipe off the excess, and then I'll dip it in the masking fluid, just so the masking fluid doesn't really get in deep into the fibers of the brush. So I'll be right back. Let me dip this in some dish soap. So you can see it, you can barely even see it on there. I've wiped off most of the excess. I dip it in the masking fluid. Maybe I'll block out the whole circle and I can fill in the negative space later. So if it comes out a little bit bigger than the shape we want, that's okay. And then there's a couple highlights on the jewelry as well. There's this ring here. They're all really bright, and I feel like it's part of the feel of the painting. It's definitely part of this model's personality. So I think it does help the painting. These over here are a little bit darker. I think those I can just paint regularly. Maybe I'll add a little bit here on the corner of the facial hair. Add a tiny bit for the eye up here. I've never done that. I've been saying for years, like the whites of the eyes are not white. Don't paint them white. But they are catching a lot, like an unnatural amount of direct light in this situation. The light is pretty low. It's coming from across and to the left. So a lot of this, I'm kind of anticipating like digging it up, wiping it off, and then painting more on top of it later. Oh, I just poured it everywhere. Oops. See, every time I use masking fluid, something bad happens. Spilled it. I'm gonna go clean off this brush real quick. I'll be right back. Oh, sorry, you can't see what I'm doing. I'm sharing my screen. After all that. Sorry. I'll zoom in a little bit here while I clean my brush. I'm gonna put this in the sun. It's taken a little while to dry. I want to make sure these are fully cured before we start painting all over this. I'm gonna put it in the sun for a minute. Be right back. All right. Sorry, it's taking kind of a while for that to dry, and it's still not. I don't know. It's a little sticky, but I want to get painting, so we can just get started. Excuse me. Picking up a couple of the pencil lines here and there. And then I'm gonna use burnt sienna for like a nice even tone across this. And then from there we can start navigating some of those light and shadow shapes along that line of the core shadow. I'm using this flat brush here. Use
Oh,
whatever brush you're comfortable using.
burnt sienna alone, Shane.
Yeah, I think just burnt sienna on its own. And I'm not going to go into these cooler areas over here. Those I want to keep light for right now. Maybe we even push some of those to be a little bit more blue, wet into wet. I don't know. Probably not. Let's just save that for later. I think we're okay down here in the forearm. It's really just along from this elbow to this shoulder, and then that a similar area, similar direction on that side of the face. I'm gonna go a little bit of yellow ochre. Sorry. Sorry if you already started painting. I'm adding a little bit of yellow ochre to the burnt sienna now that I see it. And I'm adding lots of water. I don't want this to be too dark. So there's a lot of light hitting him right here. And we could think about what's getting hit with direct light, like what's the brightest parts of here. Sorry, the brightest lights, like within the light shape. I'll lift out a little bit where I see those. So it's a balance of pigment and water and lifting as we go. And I'm just going along the skin tones here. Although this fabric is a pretty similar, it's light and warm in the light shape, so I could include that too, I think. The brightest parts of these shadows are a little bit more on the yellow side. And then remember, as it turns toward the shadow, it goes a little bit more red. So if we think of brown as a darker version of orange, if we split that apart into yellow and red, we can use that to kind of lean one way or the other as we go lighter and darker in value. Really light here in the fingers on that top hand. Just painting right through in larger shapes. And just like we did with the water last week, think about the overall gradient. Even though there's lots of tiny little light events getting lighter and darker along the way. There's there's more light here, and as we kind of radiate out from there, there's less and less light. So up here towards the top of the head, everything's going to get a little bit darker in general. I'm trying to keep most of these edges pretty soft too. So anywhere that gets a little bit sharp, I'm going to add some water. A little bit of light on the cane here. That highlight I can try to avoid. But for the rest, I'm just putting in an even tone. I'm gonna clean off this brush and put it aside for a second. So as this dries,
I may be wrong, Shane, but it seems that you in the past, you've often mapped out the shadow areas first. This time you,
that's what we're about to do. I just wanted to put like an even tone in for the light shapes,
I see.
and then everything is going to get darker from there. It kind of like pushes back the white of the paper a little bit, which can be helpful. But yeah, now I'm gonna do that. Mapping out the shadow shapes. I'm gonna use burnt sienna. Which on its own is still not that dark. And this is sort of like not wet into dry or wet into wet. It's like wet into kind of a damp thing, which I think is good. The colors move pretty slowly. But still, like you can get like a firm edge without like a really super sharp one. Which gives us some room to maneuver.
That's burnt sienna, looks like.
Mm-hmm. And if any edge gets a little sharp, you can still soften that here and there. Add a little bit more water here on this like side plane of the deltoid up here as it goes up towards the collarbone. It's just a very slight little plane change that's catching a little bit more, or it's catching a little bit less light, so it's a little bit more saturated. I'm gonna change my lights around for a second. Get rid of that glare if I can. I don't know if that's better. Seems like the masking fluid is catching some light. This light's a lot cooler. So I gotta lift some of these up. I think while I was adjusting the lights, these colors ran a little bit. So this over here, this isn't the edge of his arm. I'm right along the edge of the core shadow right here as it turns from not just light to dark, but from warm to cool. I think what we should do after this is lightly block in the background just so we have a good idea of like where we are in the figure. Because I know just looking at the screen, I could see that it's kind of hard to tell exactly where I am in here. The hand underneath the top hand, I'm not being too specific with it. It's kind of confusing even in the photo, which means in the painting, it's going to be extra tricky to navigate that. So don't worry too much about how confusing that looks. I think that's something we could sort of downplay and focus on the top hand and how it wraps around that form of everything beneath it. But don't worry too much about describing the bottom hand. So up here in this eye, I'm not worried about trying to paint a picture of like a perfect eye. All I'm really thinking about is what is the light doing for the whole eyeball, whole eye socket. All I care about is the light and shadow pattern and the edges that it creates. Same with up here on the forehead. So this cheek here is still in the light. I'm pushing this color a little bit. We're not technically not in the shadow right here, but I'm just, maybe I should have waited. Because I'm always saying, like, it's important to have a distinct difference between your light and shadow shape. It just helps for mapping everything out. But I just wanted to define that where the nose is meeting the face a little bit better. What I'd like to do is start to have an interaction with the cooler shadows, because we want to continue mapping out our shadows, but like I said, on this side, they all go a little bit cooler. You zoom out a little bit here. And we could push those a little bit bluer than the photo is telling us. So I'll mix in a little bit of burnt sienna with some ultramarine blue, but for the most part, it's mostly just blue. That burnt sienna will take the edge off a little bit.
I'm sorry, did you say cerulean with the burnt sienna?
I'm
For the-
using ultramarine.
Ultramarine,
Mhm.
for those cooler areas on the, like on the left arm.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't want to go too dark here. Being really gentle with this wet into wet. But even within that reflected light, the brightest part of the reflected light here, like as I'm going down towards that elbow, the brightest part of that reflected light is still darker than the light shape, if that makes sense. This I want to reactivate a little bit. I should have this dried faster than I would have thought. So as it meets the warmer side here in the middle, and we'll kind of readjust this more close up later, but that smooth transition, we want that to be wet into wet, and we want it to be like a clear transition from warm to cool. So we don't want to mix them up too much and get too muddy. So I'm reactivating it with some water, trying not to spread it too much. and having a clear, warm side and a cool side. And remember, like, don't worry about like the outline of this arm. We're gonna redefine that by painting the background next to it. So here too on the forearm, I'm anticipating that fabric behind the forearm being much darker. So I'm allowing myself to get darker in here. It'll become lighter by putting that darker next to it later on. My concern here is the values in here as they relate to the arm as it climbs up in this direction. I want to maintain the lights over here. I don't want to lose that warm glow from earlier. I think this cool color over here got a little polluted. I'm just kind of moving around, making sure that I'm not getting too many super sharp edges where I don't really want them yet. So adding some water, lifting some things out here and there, just trying to maintain all these different transitions as the paint starts to dry. Okay, so let's let that marinate for a minute. I'm going to clean off my palette and I just want to block in the background. Just the white of the paper is so bright, it's going to affect how we're seeing all these other values. So now that the figure is more or less locked in, I still want to address the fabric too. That'll be next, just like as a base to get us started. But yeah, for the background, I want to darken it. Help us judge our values. Trying to think. Obviously, so in the photo, it's pretty like the fabric in the back is just black. I'm always trying to think like how can we do something interesting with color? But just the straight black on its own might be the answer. Skin tones are very warm. The shadows are kind of cool on this side. There's a lot of like yellow in the lights in here, like I was saying. So that purple of the necklace is really interesting with balancing that out. There's some yellow in this bracelet of that like gold kind of yellow there. So there's a lot of, I think in the photo itself, there's a lot of balance and harmony already. So I might just keep the background pretty neutral. So I'm mixing a dark color here. If you have some kind of Payne's gray, you can use that. We're not going to go absolute darkest dark black quite yet, but that's what I'm aiming this towards. I'm using this brush here, that same, I think it's an inch. Yeah, flat, an inch wide, flat, just to like kind of go along the figure, and then I can open it up to a larger brush for the rest. And there's still like some gesture in that fabric, even though it's really subtle. We don't want to take away from the figure by having a distracting background, but we just want to map things out here. And so I'm anticipating going back again, making this all darker. But this is just going to help us understand where we are compositionally and where we are with our values. So pay close attention to the shapes of that outer contour of the figure. Here I'm passing right over that masking fluid. I hope it works. So even here still, I'm trusting my drawing like maybe 95% of the way, but I always have a little bit of skepticism. I'm gonna start from down here to kind of close that gap. Maybe I could soften this edge a little bit by just passing over it with some extra water. So this is just a clean brush with water. And again, this is kind of a placeholder. Like I think I'd like to come back and really punch in the background harder at the like more towards the end of the painting. So be careful of your edges being too razor sharp. Littlest bit of water to soften this stuff will help. Even in here, I'm trying to be very thoughtful about the apex of this curve, the planes of his head, of the skull. It's not something we pay attention to too much when we look at someone's face. I mean, I pay attention to it because I think about it all the time, but like the shape of someone's skull is not as intuitive as like the rest of the features of the face. But if it's a little bit off, it's really gonna stand out if someone's skull doesn't look right. So we have to know that going into it. We want to give it a little bit more attention than we might assume. Even these brushstrokes around the fabric is sort of an echo of what the fabric is doing and the way that it's kind of acting, kind of bunched up over there. Here, like along the slope of the shoulder, like the background stroke follows that. You can tell a lot about the forms by, I mean, we're describing them by painting the thing next to them, which in this case is the background. But even in these brushstrokes, we want to be aware of what those forms are doing, even if we're painting negative space. A little bit hard to see over here where the fabric really ends. But here too, think about the, like, I don't know, is directionality a word? Like the direction that the fabric is going in, how can you show that with every move that you make here? And how does that serve the composition? Even down here in the corner, every mark still counts. Here it's a little bit slower. There's kind of more in and out and rhythm. And again, we're not even painting the thing, we're painting the air around it. You'll be a little bit more careful. Probably should use a smaller brush. I think this is really close in value to that shadow on the skin, but I'm not there yet. So I'm not gonna like continue that up into the arm. We could deal with that later. Now I'm gonna get a way bigger brush and fill in these gaps over here with a similar color. And again, I don't have Payne's gray. I'm not using like a really black pigment, so my pigments are even by making like a neutral, supercharged, dark pigment, the pigments kind of separate a little bit, and it's giving me some interesting little results. So I kind of like that. Wow, it's 11:49. Oh my God. Okay, well, I definitely want to pick this up again next week. I'm not done yet. We got a couple minutes still, but that flew by. I feel like we're just now set up to really begin. So yeah, I'd really love more time on this. Whoops, I just threw water across the whole painting. I did kind of forget about that ear when we were blocking those in earlier. I can always get that later. Or maybe I'll even pull some of this over now. Another thing I'd like to do is just there's a little bit more red in the fabric. I'm not necessarily painting the shadow shapes of the fabric yet, but just a transparent wash over that will also just to help us set up and know the difference between the fabric and the skin.
Thanks, Shane. I got to run and make a couple bucks here, but it was a really enjoyable painting session.
Cool. Thanks for
I
being
prefer
here.
I prefer something like this over those flowers. They drove me nuts. So
Okay.
too many pieces, but this one I see, I can analyze, and I like the way you construct the layering process here. I'm getting that better now, seeing how to do it. And thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Ross. I'm glad you like it.
Okay.
I'll see you next week.
Great. Thanks a lot.
So again, just kind of sectioning off the fabric, thinking about, so it's easy when we have fabric like this, there's lots of nice little clear-cut shadow shapes for us to grab onto later. It's easy to lose sight of like the volume of his torso, like his rib cage underneath the chest muscles, all of that. So there, it's a little bit brighter in here towards the center. Let me finish painting this before it dries. A little bit brighter in here towards the center than it is on like this outside edge over here. That pattern gets a little bit foreshortened, which affects the texture of it. Maybe we'll get into that, maybe we won't. I want to say it's a little bit cooler over here. as the whole thing turns from light to dark. That overall like underlying transition, just like what we said about the head, and despite all the features sitting on top, we want to understand the big picture first. So a similar thing happening here with this fabric.
What color is that you're using, Shane?
Oh, I'm sorry, this is CAD red and CAD yellow. My
Oh.
bad. Didn't even say that.
Orange.
Even though I'm painting it all more or less one color, I'm still trying to go in the direction of the form. And I'll continue this out towards here. I'm gonna ignore that pattern down here. Oh, you can't see where I'm pointing.
I
There's a-
love the way you did the knot on top. I
Oh,
mean,
thanks.
simplified it, but it looks very good.
Thanks. Yeah, and simple. That's what we're after.
Excuse me.
Making complicated things simple is the name of the game.
Right.
So bigger brushes help. If I painted that and I was holding this brush, I would want to really get in there and do all that fun stuff right off the bat. But since I had this one, I had to just be like, okay, what's the best move I can make here?
Good point. That the wider the brush, the simpler the painting.
Yes.
You have to get into all the minor details.
Yeah, yeah. I paint with big brushes a lot as like it's like a straight jacket.
Yeah. See.
See over here, these are kind of horizontal, so I can kind of show that with these broader strokes. Even though like we'll go in and rework that later, but just like as a base layer, and I don't know, it's a way of thinking, putting these bigger pieces together. My painting versus the photo, this looks like a Zen Buddha almost. Maybe the skin tone will change as we go a little bit more, but doesn't quite look like JJ yet. I'm pushing this fabric color out to just as a stand-in for the shadow shape over here. Since they're both darker and warmer, I think that's okay.
Now, will you put in all the creases in the in that I don't even know what you call it, is drape?
Yeah, absolutely. So just like we did with the skin tone, this is like an underlying color, and maybe I'll lift out a little bit. So I anticipate going in and painting all those creases, but I want to make sure. So I'm just kind of, I want to make sure. So it's, if we go in and paint all those, we run the risk of flattening it out just a little bit. We want to paint like the bigger forms first. Were you, Larry, I think, did you paint that pumpkin with us? Like, might have been a
Yes.
semester ago.
Yeah, I
So
did.
there were all those little sections in the pumpkin.
Remember that.
Instead of going in and painting them all right from the start, we wanted to understand the whole form first.
Right.
Kind of a similar situation here. And we don't want to dive in and get those individual creases just yet. We'll kind of build up the whole form of the torso first and how it wraps around, and then from there we can carve it up into smaller pieces.
I see. Good.
I'm gonna just soften, if I can, I'm gonna soften this edge of the head. It's a little too angular and blocky. Because like we were saying earlier, we were looking at all those portraits. We can control where the contrast is. Like the contrast here in the ear, that sharp edge on the ear works, I think, because it also brings us to that shape of the earring. But up here, as the head rolls back into space, that should really be a softer edge. Like a round form like that curving away from us tends to be a little bit smoother than like a quick plane change. It's more of a slow plane change. I had a teacher describe that to me once because it was a painting of the ocean and the horizon was too sharp. And he was explaining like the earth is round, the horizon's curving away from us. It can't be that. It's not a quick plane change. If you believe that the earth is round, which I do.
I had to run too, Shane. Thanks a bunch.
Cool. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being here, everybody. I think that I won't try anything else today since we're pretty much at the end of class. Let's have this ready to go next week and we'll keep working on it. Thank you all for being here.
That's good, Shane. Thank you so much.
Of course, I'll
feeling
see you all
better?
later. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
bye.
Thanks,
next
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.